The morning mist clung to the fjord like a spirit reluctant to leave, its ghostly tendrils weaving between the weathered wooden posts of Bjornstad village. Astrid knelt beside her father's workbench, grinding juniper berries with practiced precision, the mortar's rhythm steady as her heartbeat. The familiar scent of herbs, chamomile, yarrow, and dried cloudberries filled their modest dwelling, a sanctuary of healing amidst the harsh Norwegian wilderness. "Careful with the willow bark." "And daughter," Leif murmured, his weathered hands sorting through dried roots. "Too much, and it becomes poison rather than medicine," Astrid nodded, her pale blue eyes focused on the delicate balance required. At 19, she had inherited her father's gift for healing, though villagers whispered she possessed something more, an intuition that seemed to flow from the very earth itself. Her auburn hair, braided with leather cords, caught the amber light filtering through their small window, and her hands, though young, moved with the certainty of someone who had eased countless ailments. The door's heavy wood groaned as someone pushed it open. "Healer Leif," called Gunnar, one of the Jarl's retainers, his broad frame filling the doorway. "The Jarl requests your presence. There's been an injury during the morning hunt." Astrid's pulse quickened at the mention of Jarl Magnus. She had seen him only from distance during village gatherings, his commanding presence unmistakable among his men. Dark hair streaked with early silver, shoulders that could bear the weight of leadership, and eyes like winter storms. He was everything a Jarl should be, and everything she should not desire. "I'll prepare the kit," Astrid said, rising to gather supplies. Her father's joints had grown stiff with age, and increasingly she accompanied him on such calls. "No need, child," Leif replied gently. "Stay and tend to old Sigrid's poultice. The Jarl's hall is no place for what, father?" Astrid's voice carried a note of challenge she rarely allowed herself. "For someone who can set bones and stitch wounds." Gunnar shifted uncomfortably. "Actually, Leif, the injury is severe. You might need assistance." After a moment's hesitation, Leif nodded. "Very well, but stay close and speak only when spoken to." The journey to the Jarl's hall took them through the village centre, where morning life bustled with purpose. Children chased geese between the longhouses, their laughter echoing off the timber walls. Women worked at looms, creating the woolen cloth that would see them through another harsh winter. The scent of baking bread mixed with wood smoke and the ever-present salt tang from the fjord. Magnus's hall rose above the other buildings like a great wooden ship, its dragon-carved posts reaching toward the slate-grey sky. Inside, the air hung thick with smoke from the central hearth, where flames danced around logs that could burn for days. Tapestries depicting great hunts and battles adorned the walls, while weapons gleamed from their resting places. In here, Gunnar led them to a side chamber where Magnus lay upon a bed of furs, his left shoulder dark with blood. An arrow had pierced clean through, its barbed head protruding from his back. Astrid's breath caught, not from the wound, though it was serious, but from seeing him so close. Even injured, Magnus commanded attention. His jaw was set against pain, but when his storm-grey eyes met hers, she felt something shift inside her chest, like ice cracking on a spring river. "Jarl Magnus." Leif bowed respectfully. "We'll have you mended soon. The arrow must come out," Magnus said, his voice rough with pain. "But carefully, it's close to vital vessels." Astrid studied the wound with professional detachment, though her heart raced. "Father, if we push it through, the barbed head will cause more damage. But if we try to pull it back, the fletching will tear the entry wound wider," Leif finished, pride flickering in his eyes. "What do you suggest?" "Cut the shaft close to the skin, then push the head through from behind. I can guide it to avoid the major vessels." Her voice was steady, despite Magnus's intense gaze upon her. "Wise counsel," Magnus murmured. "From such young lips." Heat flushed Astrid's cheeks, but she maintained her composure. "Gunnar will need strong ale and clean cloths. Father, your sharpest knife." The next hour tested all her skills. With Magnus gripping a leather strap between his teeth, Astrid guided her father's hands as they worked the arrow free. Her fingers, slender and sure, pressed against the Jarl's skin to feel for the pulse of blood beneath. Ensuring they didn't sever anything vital, "There," she whispered, as the arrowhead finally emerged. "Now we clean and stitch." Magnus had remained conscious throughout, his eyes often finding hers during the most painful moments. When she cleaned the wound with ale-soaked cloth, he didn't flinch. When her fingers moved to check the stitching, his skin seemed to burn beneath her touch. "You have skilled hands, healer's daughter," he said as Leif applied the final bandage. "Skilled and gentle. Thank you, my Jarl," she replied formally, though his words sent warmth spiraling through her. "What is your name?" "Astrid, my Jarl." "Astrid Leif's daughter." "Astrid," he repeated, and somehow her name sounded different on his lips, richer, more significant. "Thank you." That evening, as autumn darkness settled over Bjornstadt like a familiar cloak, Astrid found herself restless. She had assisted her father with healings before, but this felt different. Magnus's gaze had lingered on her in a way that spoke of more than gratitude, and she couldn't deny the answering flutter in her chest. She stepped outside their dwelling, breathing in the crisp night air. The aurora borealis painted the sky in ethereal greens and blues, the lights dancing like spirits celebrating some cosmic joy. It was said the northern lights appeared when great changes were coming, when fate itself shifted course. Beautiful, aren't they? The voice came from the shadows near their door. Astrid spun, her heart leaping. Magnus emerged from the darkness, moving carefully but under his own power. He had exchanged his bloodied shirt for a simple tunic, and without his ceremonial armor, he seemed more man than legend. "My Jarl," she breathed. "You should be resting. Your wound is well tended, thanks to you." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the leather and pine scent that seemed to cling to his skin. "I couldn't sleep, neither could she, but admitting such felt dangerous. The aurora is particularly bright tonight, yes." But his eyes weren't on the sky. They were on her face, studying her features in the mystical light. "Astrid, what I felt today, when your hands were healing me—" "My Jarl, I don't understand." He reached up, his fingers barely grazing her cheek. The touch sent lightning through her nerves. "Don't you?" She did understand, and that terrified her. This man, this Jarl who could have any woman he chose, was looking at her as if she held some precious secret. And perhaps she did, for her own heart was betraying every lesson her father had taught her about knowing one's place. "This cannot be," she whispered. "No," he agreed, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw. "It cannot. Yet here we stand." The aurora pulsed overhead, bathing them both in otherworldly light. In that moment, beneath the ancient dance of the northern sky, something fundamental shifted between them. It was more than attraction, deeper than desire. It was recognition, as if their souls had been calling to each other across the gulf of station and circumstance. "I should go inside," Astrid said, though she made no move to leave. "Yes," Magnus replied, though his hand remained gentle against her face. "We both should forget this moment." But even as he spoke, they both knew forgetting was impossible. Some forces, once awakened, could not be easily contained, and what sparked between them felt as eternal and unstoppable as the lights dancing overhead. When he finally stepped back, the cold air rushed between them like a barrier. "Good night, Astrid Leif's daughter. Good night." "My Jarl." She watched him disappear into the darkness, then remained there long after, staring up at the aurora and wondering if the ancient stories were true, if the lights really did herald great changes, great challenges to come. Inside the longhouse, her father was preparing for sleep, unaware that his daughter's world had just tilted on its axis. Astrid moved quietly to her sleeping alcove, but rest would not come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Magnus's face in the mystical light, felt the echo of his touch on her skin. By morning, she told herself, this madness would pass. By morning, she would remember her place as the healer's daughter, and he would remember his as Jarl. The barrier between their worlds would reassert itself, solid and impenetrable as the mountains that ringed their fjord. But morning seemed very far away, and the aurora still danced in the sky, promising that some changes, once begun, could not be undone. 3 days passed like a fever dream. Magnus's wound healed with remarkable speed under Astrid's careful ministrations, though each visit to change his bandages left her increasingly unsettled. He watched her work with an intensity that made her hands tremble, and she found herself taking longer than necessary, savoring each moment of legitimate closeness. The village buzzed with preparation for the Harvest Moon Festival, when the season's final crops would be celebrated and the ancestors honored. Astrid helped her father prepare healing drafts for the inevitable excesses of celebration while trying to ignore the flutter in her chest whenever she glimpsed Magnus directing the preparations. "You're distracted and Jarl," Leif observed as Astrid nearly spilled a precious vial of valerian extract. "Your mind wanders like a bird seeking its nest." Heat flushed her cheeks. "I'm sorry, father. I'll be more careful." He studied her with the penetrating gaze that had always seen too much. "It's natural for a young woman to notice strong men, Astrid, but some paths lead only to heartbreak." Before she could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window they saw Magnus striding toward the village center, his face dark with anger. Behind him trailed several members of his council, including the stern-faced Sven Ironhand, whose disapproval seemed to precede him like a storm cloud. "What troubles the Jarl?" Astrid asked. "Word came this morning," Leif replied grimly. "Raiders have been spotted along the coast. Ships flying no banners, testing our defenses." Astrid's blood chilled. Bjornstad had known peace for several years, but their prosperity made them a tempting target. The village's warriors were skilled, but their numbers were small compared to some of the larger settlements. That evening, as torches began to flicker to life throughout the village, Astrid found herself once again drawn outside. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat from the early festival preparations. But underneath lay something else, tension, like the charge before a thunderstorm. She was tending to their herb garden when footsteps approached. Not the measured tread of her father, but something lighter, more purposeful. "The rosemary grows well despite the cold." Magnus's voice emerged from the gathering dusk. Astrid straightened slowly, her pulse quickening. "My Jarl, how is your shoulder?" "Healed, thanks to your skill." He moved closer, and she could see the weight of leadership etched in the lines around his eyes. "Though I fear I may test your abilities again soon." "The raiders?" 3 ships well armed. They probe our defenses, seeking weakness." He paused beside her garden plot, his presence both comforting and dangerous. "Tell me, Astrid, what do you know of war?" The question surprised her. "I know how to treat the wounds it leaves behind. Beyond that," she shrugged, then found courage she didn't know she possessed. "I know that good leaders carry the weight of every life in their care." Magnus turned to study her face in the torchlight. "Wise words. But sometimes a leader must risk those lives to preserve them. And sometimes," Astrid said softly, "a leader must risk his own heart for the same reason." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Magnus stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Astrid," he began, his voice rough with suppressed emotion, "my Jarl." But her protest lacked conviction. "Say my name," he requested, his hand rising to cup her face. "Just once, say my name as a woman speaks to a man, not a subject to her lord." Her breath caught. Such familiarity was dangerous, possibly treasonous. Yet under the weight of his gaze, with the scent of pine and leather surrounding her, she found herself whispering, "Magnus." He closed his eyes as if her voice caused him pain. "When you say it thus, I forget everything else. My duties, my obligations, the council's expectations. Then I should not say it." "No," he agreed, opening his eyes to capture hers. "Yet I would hear nothing else for the rest of my days." The confession shattered something inside her chest. This powerful man, who commanded warriors and directed the fate of their village, was laying his vulnerability before her like an offering. The realization that she held such power over him was both thrilling and terrifying. "Magnus," she said again, savoring the feel of his name on her tongue. "What are we doing?" "Something foolish," he admitted, his thumb tracing the curve of her lips. "Something that could destroy us both. Yet even as he spoke, he was leaning closer, and Astrid found herself rising on her toes to meet him. Their lips touched like the first spark of flint on steel, tentative then catching fire. The kiss deepened, years of longing and denial pouring into that single point of connection. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Magnus rested his forehead against hers, his hands tangled in her hair. "This cannot continue," he whispered. "I know." But her arms had wound around his neck, holding him close. The council would never accept it. "Sven Ironhand already questions my decisions, watches for any sign of weakness. I know. If they discovered this, you would be branded a seductress, cast out or worse. Your father would suffer for my sins." The mention of her father's potential fate cut through the haze of desire. Astrid stepped back, cold air rushing between them like a physical barrier. "Then we must stop. Before anyone sees, before anyone suspects." Magnus nodded, though his eyes remained locked on hers. "Yes, we must." But neither moved to leave. They stood there in the garden, surrounded by the scents of herbs and autumn earth. Both knowing they were promising something neither had the strength to keep. "The festival begins tomorrow," Magnus said finally. "There will be dancing, celebration. You'll be there?" "With my father, tending to any injuries or ailments that arise." "Of course." A pause. "Save me one dance, Astrid. Just one, in the crowd where we might touch without causing scandal." She should refuse. Every rational thought screamed at her to refuse. Instead, she found herself nodding. "One dance." Magnus smiled then, the first truly joyful expression she'd seen from him since his injury. It transformed his face, making him appear younger, less burdened by the weight of leadership. "Until tomorrow, then." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Dream well, healer's daughter. And you, my Jarl." She watched him disappear into the darkness before returning inside, where her father was banking the fire for the night. If he noticed her flushed cheeks or the way her hands trembled slightly, he made no comment. That night, Astrid lay in her alcove listening to the wind whistle around their dwelling. Tomorrow would bring the festival, with its music and laughter and ancient rituals. It would also bring the promised dance, one moment of sanctioned intimacy that would have to sustain her through whatever darkness lay ahead, for she was beginning to understand that their stolen moments couldn't last. The weight of Magnus's duties, the expectations of his position, and the growing threat from the sea would soon demand choices that might tear them apart forever. But tonight, she could still feel the warmth of his lips on hers, still hear the way he'd said her name like a prayer. Tonight, she could pretend that love might somehow find a way to conquer all the forces arrayed against it. Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of waves against the shore, and somewhere in that rhythm, she finally found sleep, filled with dreams of dancing in strong arms, while storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The Harvest Moon Festival transformed Bjornstad into a realm of magic and music. Colorful banners fluttered from every rooftop, and the great bonfire in the village center sent sparks dancing toward the star-laden sky. The air thrummed with fiddle music and laughter, the scent of roasted meat and honey mead creating an intoxicating atmosphere. Astrid moved through the celebration beside her father, the healer's satchel ready for the inevitable minor injuries that came with festive excess. She wore her finest dress, deep blue wool with silver thread embroidered around the neckline, a gift from her mother before her passing. Her hair was braided with ribbons, and despite her attempts at modesty, she could feel appreciative glances following her through the crowd. "Beautiful night," commented Eric Thorsen, a young farmer who had been showing increased interest in her lately. "The harvest was good this year, and the celebrations promised to be memorable." "Indeed," Astrid replied politely, though her eyes searched the crowd for a different figure entirely. Eric stepped closer, emboldened by the festival atmosphere. "Perhaps later you might honor me with a dance." "I've been practicing the steps." Before she could respond, a commotion near the great fire drew their attention. Magnus had emerged from his hall, resplendent in his ceremonial armor, polished male that caught the firelight, a great cloak of bare fur across his shoulders, and the golden arm rings that marked his status. He moved with the confident grace of a natural leader, acknowledging the cheers and toasts raised in his honor. But when his eyes found hers across the crowd, Astrid felt the world narrow to that single connection. Everything else, the music, the laughter, Eric's continued conversation, faded to meaningless noise. Magnus's gaze held hers for a long, dangerous moment before he was forced to turn his attention to Sven Ironhand and the other council members. "The Jarl looks well," Eric observed, following her line of sight. "His wound from the hunt has healed remarkably fast. Your father's skill is renowned throughout the region." "Yes," Astrid murmured, tearing her gaze away with effort. "Father is very skilled." The evening progressed with traditional ceremonies, the blessing of the final harvest, toasts to the ancestors, and the ritual feeding of the sacred fire. Astrid found herself constantly aware of Magnus's presence, even when he was across the gathering. It was as if some invisible thread connected them, tugging at her awareness whenever he moved or spoke. When the dancing began in earnest, couples swirled around the great fire in patterns as old as the village itself. Eric appeared at her elbow, offering his hand with hopeful determination. "Surely now you can spare a dance?" he asked. Astrid hesitated, glancing toward where Magnus stood in conversation with several neighboring farmers. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Aye." "Yes, one dance," she agreed, placing her hand in Eric's. The farmer beamed and led her into the circle of dancers. The music was lively, the steps familiar from countless festivals past. Eric was an adequate partner, enthusiastic if not particularly graceful. But as they spun and stepped in time with the others, Astrid found herself imagining different arms around her, a different partner guiding her through the ancient movements. When the song ended, Eric was reluctant to let her go. "Another?" he asked hopefully. "I should check on father," she demurred, stepping back from his embrace. "Of course, your duties," Eric said, though disappointment colored his voice. "Perhaps later." Astrid nodded non-committally and made her way to the edge of the gathering, where Leif was indeed tending to an overly enthusiastic celebrant who had taken a tumble. As she helped her father rebandage a scraped knee, she was acutely aware of the conversations flowing around them. "The Jarl seems distracted tonight," observed Sigrid, the baker's wife. "Perhaps the burden of leadership weighs heavily. Or perhaps he's finally considering taking a wife," added Helga Ironhand, Sven's wife, with the knowing look of a woman who made it her business to oversee everyone else's affairs. "It's past time he secured the succession." Astrid's hands stilled on the bandage. The patient, deep in his cups, didn't notice, but her father shot her a sharp glance. "There are several suitable matches among the neighboring Jarl's daughters," Helga continued. "The alliance with Jarl Ragnar's family would be particularly advantageous, especially with raiders threatening our coasts." "Astrid," her father said quietly, "mind the binding." She realized she had been wrapping the bandage too tightly and quickly loosened it. But Helga's words had struck her like physical blows. Of course Magnus would need to marry strategically. Of course his choice of bride would be dictated by politics and alliances rather than personal feeling. She had been a fool to think otherwise, even for a moment. The music shifted to a slower, more intimate melody, the traditional song for couples who wished to declare serious intentions. Around the fire, pairs drew closer together, some kissing openly in the firelight. Astrid watched with an ache in her chest as the celebration of love and commitment played out before her. "You look pale, daughter," Leif observed, completing his patient's care. "Perhaps you should rest." "No, I'm fine, it's warm near the fire," but she wasn't fine. The weight of impossibility was settling over her like a burial shroud. Whatever had sparked between her and Magnus was doomed from the start. She was the healer's daughter, useful for her skills, but beneath consideration as anything more. He was Jarl, bound by duty to choose a bride who would strengthen his position and secure his legacy. Astrid. The voice came from directly behind her. She turned to find Magnus standing there, having approached while her attention was focused on the dancers. This close, she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "My Jarl," she said formally, acutely aware that they were in public, surrounded by watching eyes. "I believe you promised me a dance," he said, extending his hand. Every reasonable thought screamed at her to refuse. Accept such an invitation would be dangerous, potentially scandalous. Yet her hand seemed to move of its own accord, settling into his larger one. "One dance," she said quietly. Magnus led her into the circle of couples, his arms settling around her waist with careful propriety. To the watching village, it might appear to be nothing more than their Jarl honoring one of his subjects with his attention. But Astrid could feel the tremor in his hands, see the storm brewing in his grey eyes. They moved together as if they had been dancing for years, her body responding instinctively to his lead. The music seemed to wrap around them, creating a bubble of intimacy amidst the crowd. Other couples danced nearby, but Astrid was aware only of Magnus, the scent of leather and pine that clung to him, the warmth of his hand at her waist, the way his eyes never left her face. "You're beautiful tonight," he murmured, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Don't," she whispered back. "Don't make this harder than it already is. I can't help it. When I see you like this, surrounded by music and firelight, I forget every reason why this is impossible." The song was nearing its end, their time together almost over. Magnus drew her slightly closer, close enough that she could feel the steady beat of his heart against her palm. "After tonight, we must stop this madness," she said, though the words felt like tearing pieces from her soul. "Yes," he agreed, his jaw tight. "After tonight." But even as they spoke of ending whatever was between them, their bodies told a different story. They moved together with perfect harmony, as if they were two halves of a single whole, finally united. Other dancers glanced their way with knowing smiles, assuming they were witnessing a courtship in its early stages. If only they knew the truth, that this was not a beginning, but an ending. One perfect moment before duty and circumstance tore them apart forever. The music faded, leaving them standing motionless in each other's arms, while couples around them began to separate or move into the next dance. Magnus's hand lingered at her waist a moment longer than propriety demanded before he stepped back. "Thank you for the dance, Astrid Life's daughter," he said formally, though his eyes held volumes of unspoken words. "The honor was mine, my Jarl," she replied, executing a proper curtsy, despite the way her legs trembled. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Astrid!" She looked back, seeing him silhouetted against the great fire like some ancient god of war and longing. "Whatever comes," he said quietly, "remember that you have been more to me than duty ever could." Before she could respond, Sven Ironhand appeared at Magnus's elbow, his weathered face stern with disapproval. "My Jarl," Sven said, his gaze flicking meaningfully between them. "The council requires your attention. There are matters of defense to discuss." Magnus nodded curtly. "Of course." He looked once more at Astrid, a glance that felt like a farewell. Before following Sven toward the great hall, Astrid remained by the fire, watching until his broad shoulders disappeared into the crowd. Around her the celebration continued, but she felt hollow, as if something essential had been carved from her chest. "Astrid!" Eric Thorson appeared beside her again, his face hopeful. "Another dance?" She looked at the young farmer, kind, earnest, entirely suitable. The sort of man her father would approve of, the sort who could offer her a simple, uncomplicated life filled with modest happiness. "Yes," she said, placing her hand in his. "Let's dance." But as Eric spun her through the familiar steps, her heart remained by the great fire, burning like the sacred flames that would smolder long after the celebration ended. And somewhere in the depths of the great hall, she imagined Magnus felt the same hollow ache, the same sense of something precious being sacrificed on the altar of duty and expectation. The celebration would continue until dawn, but for both of them, the true festival was already over, ended with a single dance that had to last a lifetime. Dawn crept over the fjord like a reluctant messenger, painting the sky in shades of pearl and rose gold. Astrid had slept little, her dreams haunted by the memory of Magnus's arms around her and the weight of inevitability that seemed to press down upon her chest. She rose early, helping her father prepare healing draughts for those recovering from the festival's excesses, grateful for work that kept her hands busy and her mind focused. The village was just beginning to stir when the alarm horns sounded, 3 long blasts that sent ice through every heart in Bjornstad. "Raiders, and they were close. Get the emergency supplies," Leif commanded, all traces of sleep vanishing from his weathered face. "Gather everything we'll need for battle wounds." Astrid's training took over, suppressing the fear that threatened to paralyze her. She packed their healing kit with swift efficiency, while outside, the sounds of organized chaos filled the air, warriors arming themselves, mothers herding children to safety, livestock being driven to secure pens. Through their small window, she could see Magnus in the village center, his voice carrying clearly as he issued orders with calm authority. He had donned his battle armor, the mail gleaming dully in the early light, his great sword hanging at his side. Even in crisis, he commanded absolute attention and respect. 3 ships, Gunnar reported breathlessly, having run from the watchtowers. Flying the Raven banner, Jarl Bjorn the Ruthless leads them. A murmur of recognition rippled through the gathered warriors. Bjorn's reputation for cruelty was legendary throughout Norway, his raids leaving nothing but ash and widows in their wake. "How many men?" Magnus asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of their situation. "Perhaps 60 warriors, my Jarl." Well armed and battle-tested, Astrid's heart clenched. Bjornstad could muster perhaps 40 defenders, and while they were skilled, they were farmers and fishermen first, warriors second. The odds were not in their favor. "Then we make them pay dearly for whatever they think to gain here," Magnus declared. "Sven, position the archers on the high ground. Eric, take the younger men and secure the harbor approach. I'll lead the main force to meet them at the beach." As the warriors dispersed to their positions, Magnus's gaze found Astrid through the crowd. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment she saw not the confident Jarl, but the man who had held her in his arms, who had whispered her name like a prayer. He raised one hand in what might have been a blessing or farewell. She couldn't tell which. Then he was striding toward the harbor, his warriors falling into step behind him, and Astrid felt her world tilt dangerously. The fear she'd managed to suppress suddenly overwhelmed her, not for herself or even the village, but for him. The thought of Magnus falling to some raider's blade, of never again seeing the storm-grey eyes that haunted her dreams, was unbearable. "Astrid," her father said sharply, "focus. People will need us today." She nodded, forcing herself to concentrate on their preparations. But even as she sorted bandages and sharpened surgical tools, part of her awareness remained fixed on the distant sounds of battle, the clash of steel on steel, the war cries of fighting men, the occasional scream that spoke of serious injury or worse. The first wounded began arriving within the hour. Eric Thorson, sporting a deep gash on his sword arm, but grinning with battle fever. 2 of the younger warriors with various cuts and bruises. An older fighter with an arrow through his thigh, cursing fluently while Astrid worked to remove it without causing further damage. "How goes the battle?" she asked as she stitched Eric's wound. "Well enough," he replied, though sweat beaded his forehead from pain. "The Jarl fights like one of the old heroes. I've never seen anything like it. He's already felled 3 of Bjorn's champions." Relief flooded through her, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the fighting was far from over. As if to emphasize the point, another group of wounded arrived, these injuries more serious. Among them was Gunnar, supported by 2 other men, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. "The tide has turned," he gasped as Leif examined his injury. Bjorn himself challenged the Jarl to single combat. "Winner takes all, the village or the raiders retreat." Astrid's hands stilled on the bandage she was preparing. Single combat between leaders was an ancient tradition, but it meant everything depended on Magnus's skill alone. If he fell, when? she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Now, Gunnar replied. They're fighting on the beach as we speak. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Astrid abandoned her station and ran toward the harbour. Behind her she could hear her father calling her name, but she didn't stop. She had to know Magnus's fate with her own eyes. The beach was ringed with warriors from both sides, creating a circle around the two combatants. Bjorn the Ruthless was a massive man, his beard braided with bone charms, his axe singing through the air with devastating force. Magnus matched him blow for blow, his swordwork elegant and precise. But Astrid could see the exhaustion in his movements. He had been fighting for hours already. She pushed through the crowd until she had a clear view of the combat. Both men were bleeding from multiple wounds, their breathing labored, but neither showed any sign of yielding. Magnus parried a crushing overhead strike, then riposted with lightning speed, opening a line across Bjorn's ribs. The raider leader roared in pain and fury. Redoubling his attacks, the battle raged back and forth across the sand, sometimes in Magnus's favor, sometimes in Bjorn's. Astrid found herself gripping the arm of the warrior beside her hard enough to leave marks, her breath coming in short gasps that matched the rhythm of the combat. Then Bjorn's axe found its mark, biting deep into Magnus's side. He stumbled, his guard dropping for a crucial moment, and the raider pressed his advantage with brutal efficiency. Magnus fell to one knee, crimson spreading across the sand beneath him. Astrid started forward instinctively, but strong hands caught her arms, holding her back. "You cannot interfere," Sven hissed in her ear. "This is sacred combat." Magnus struggled to rise, using his sword as support. Bjorn advanced with the confidence of a predator, closing on wounded prey, his axe raised for the killing blow. The crowd held its collective,